Since before recorded history, the people of Britain have had first-hand experience of the strange and unusual. Spirits who haunt ancient castles, stories of werewolves and banshees roaming the countryside, and fantastic creatures like gnomes, fairies and pixies, all firmly embedded in our native folklore. This cultural experience makes us uniquely qualified to research these types of phenomena and help us find the truth of the reality that surrounds us. So sit back and relax as your hosts, Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson, take you on a journey through this strange realm and together help us find the answers to the mysteries that lie just beyond our grasp. Welcome to Paranormal UK Radio.
And good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Paranormal UK Radio here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. We are, of course, the flagship show on the PAUK Radio Network. And I'm your temporary host tonight, Mark Johnson. For the first hour of the program anyway, Irene got tied up, but she's going to join us here for the second hour of the program. But in the meantime, we are also joined by our stalwart co-host, Andy Mercer. How are you tonight, Andy?
Hello, I'm not too bad. A little touch of a cold, so excuse me if I sound a bit nasally. But yeah, this has become a regular thing. Ari just taking a back seat, not doing very much, leaving it to the lads to sort it all out. Well, what can we say? We'll do our best, won't we, Mark?
Yeah, we'll do our best, and we better watch what we say, because when she comes back in the second hour, she'll wallop us. if we don't behave. Well, you know what, we're gonna get right into the interview tonight, because our first guest, and we do have two guests tonight, our first guest for the first hour, we're really excited to have this gentleman on. I've been wanting to have him on for many years. Andy, would you like to introduce him?
Yes, it's going to be absolutely excellent to be able to speak to a chap I've known on and off for a number of years. I was originally involved in his EarthQuest group back in the 1980s, and that was the time Irene was talking about with the Black Alchemist. But I know he's since gone on to write numerous books on the topic we're going to be talking about tonight, and I found them all absolutely fascinating. He's an excellent researcher, very first class in his work, and it's my friend Andrew Collins.
I'm good, yes. Good day to everybody there.
Well, and Andrew, thank you for coming on. And again, for a lot of people who I wouldn't know who is not familiar with you, you've not only written several books, including Gobeckli Tepi, Genesis of the Gods, Atlantis in the Caribbean, and Beneath the Pyramids, as well as one that was Irene's favorite, which was The Black Alchemist, and also you've appeared on the Ancient Aliens television show. And the subjects you write on are really close to my heart, because I'm fascinated with, I guess the best term is calling it alternative history. And it's only alternative in the fact that it's not generally accepted by mainstream science, but yet there's so much evidence out there that history as we know it is completely wrong. And there are much older civilizations that have existed on here way before the accepted version of the Sumerians civilization from 5,000 years ago. So I just wanted to ask with this subject, I know this is a general subject, but just for our listeners, how you got so interested in researching ancient history and coming up with these alternative views on history.
Well, I think when I was a kid, I used to read books on UFOs, which always fascinated me, and they would always extend into other mysteries, whether it be UFOs in the Bible or UFOs in the past, and that, I think, probably led me on to Chariot the Gods by Eric von Daniken, and I read that, and it talks about a number of important ancient sites around the world, everywhere from the Nazca Lines to the pyramids of Mexico, pyramids of Egypt, and everything in between. And although the questions that were being asked in that book was, did aliens have any involvement in constructing these? Although I didn't really even consider that as a possibility, it fascinated me that there were all these sites, all these places that have such enigmas and questions still hanging over them. Everything from this rust-free iron pillar, in a temple in India, to strange plates found, in caves in China, to underground caves in Ecuador that contain all this incredible treasure and gold. I mean, I loved all that, and it made me think I would like to get involved in this, and I would like to investigate these mysteries. And I think at that time it was probably more wishful thinking than anything else, as I continued on to be a UFO researcher, but that sort of spread into more paranormal things, and that eventually led to working with psychics, and I started to work quite closely with what I call direct information psychics, those people that can come up with names, dates and places with a high degree of accuracy. Their percentage factor of hits is extremely high, and they would talk about historical places. I would check it out, and I would get a thrill out of finding that they were absolutely accurate in what they were saying. But one of the people involved was a guy called Bernard, and he's the guy featured in the book The Black Alchemist. And he started having dreams about the plateau at Giza, in particular the Sphinx and what lie below the Sphinx. And he felt that it was the remnant of some kind of lost civilization, and that this would one day be found. And I became sort of transfixed with this idea that there was something beneath the plateau at Giza. I realized that people like Edgar Cayce, the famous American psychic, had also talked about hidden chambers under the Sphinx, the so-called Hall of Records. And that was it. But once again, it was just sort of fantasy, the idea that I might one day investigate it. But one thing led to another, and eventually my books were taken on by mainstream publishers. They got published internationally, and my emphasis changed from working on psychic matters to pure ancient mysteries, basically, and trying to solve those mysteries. And the first of the sensible books that I did was From the Ashes of Angels, which came out in 1996. And I worked on that research-wise with my colleague Richard Wald, who I know Andy knows very well.
Indeed.
And we put together this book, which was basically showing that the Watchers and the Nephilim of the Book of Enoch are a memory of these human beings that existed right the way down to the end of the last ice age, and probably kick-started human civilization, and that they had a particular appearance. They were extremely tall, possibly sort of almost albino-like appearance. They were very immoral in their actions, but also they wore feather coats, which almost certainly made them shaman. And all the indications were that they were like the elite behind the foundation of the Neolithic Revolution, which took place in southeast Turkey and northern Iraq and northern Syria around 10,000 BC. Well, all this went into the book From the Ashes of Angels, and then just a few years later, in this exact area, this place called Gobeckli Tepi is discovered. And this is almost like the smoking gun of a lost civilization. And everything that I'd been writing about in my books was essentially confirmed by the discovery of this place called Gobeckli Tepi. And everything seemed to revolve around that. And, I started to look into that. I went over there for the first time in 2004, started to realize it was astronomically aligned to the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial swan, wrote a book about that, and, the rest has sort of tumbled through until the modern day. I'm still writing about it now. And as you said, just a couple of nights ago, I was on Ancient Aliens. It featured my work to do with Gobeckli Tepi, my work to do with Cygnus, and it seems as if it's now a really big thing and it's taken off. And I'm so glad that I was, onto Gobeckli Tepi so early on after its discovery. there we go. Still talking about it now.
Well, I noticed that you have a new book coming out next year called The Cygnus Key, which is tying in the whole Cygnus constellation with Gobeckli Tepi. And I'm with you there. I find Gobeckli Tepi to be very fascinating for a number of reasons. Between it and Pumapunku in Bolivia, between those two sites, seem to defy all explanation, at least for our modern scientists, about how such advanced structures were built so long ago when we're supposed to be in basically the Stone Age, flint knapping and whatnot.
Absolutely.
And go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to ask. We have a slight delay here. You go ahead. I defer to you.
Okay. Well, look, Gobeckli Tepi was built at a time when, in theory, we were just coming out at the end of the last ice age. There'd been a mini ice age just beforehand called the Younger Dryas event. This had lasted about 1,200 years. And, people shouldn't really have been wanting to construct huge, great, monolithic architecture, so soon after the ice age. And nor should the idea that hundreds of hunter-gatherers should want to come together to create these veritable Stonehenges, each with all of their stones carved with beautiful animals and creatures of the natural world, but also with these strange T-shaped terminations suggesting that they are, human forms embedded within stone itself. All of this shouldn't have been going on, so something was happening. And my explanation in Gobeckli Tepi, Genesis of the Gods, was that these people were still scared in relation to a cataclysm which had occurred, probably a comet impact, which had actually triggered this mini ice age, probably around 10,800 BC, although with a number of aftermath events going on for many hundreds of years afterwards, all the way around the world. And that people at this time were still in shock, and not just shock, but the fear that every time a comet appeared in the sky, bad things were going to happen again, perhaps even the end of the world this time. And I think that what happened was that various groups of elite shaman who existed at this time, what we call complex hunter-gatherers, who would work with these shaman, took advantage of this situation in a way and became the first psychologists or the first psychoanalysts, and heard what the people were saying and said, look, we can sort it out. If you do what we ask of you, you will have no more problems from these supernatural creatures that enter into our skies, and will one day be called comets. And what they got them to do was to build these incredible monuments. And that every time a comet or some other weird omen would appear in the sky, they would do rituals, and these rituals would be to appease these supernatural forces that caused these cataclysmic events, and everything was fine. And this went on probably for about 1,500 years, from about 9,500 to about 8,000 BC. And at the end of that, it seems as if there was no longer any need to create these types of monuments. Things were changing. We now had the Neolithic Revolution, which introduced agriculture, animal domestication, metallurgy, and various other things which changed the dynamics of lifestyle. And it also started to move away from its epicenter, which was southeast Turkey, into places like Eastern Europe, northwards, eastwards, and southwards, obviously, into places like Egypt. So this was the consequence of this cataclysm and the way it was handled afterwards. And if you look at so many ancient accounts of cataclysms, you'll find that there's only a few survivors, like Noah and his wife and their sons or whatever. And the first thing that they would do would be to make praise to their God and say, please don't do it ever again. And this don't ever do it again is the same, I think, as constructing Gobeckli Tepi. They went out and constructed the first monumental architecture as a response to the cataclysm itself. I'm not saying this is the only thing that they were doing there, but it's one of a number of features which almost certainly are related to the carved imagery found at Göbekli Tepe.
Do you think that we are dealing with the oldest example of civilization then that's built these kinds of monuments, Andy?
I think that the technology came and the actual mindset to be able to do it came from a much earlier period, yeah. But I don't think it's as easy as some people would like to just put a finger and say it's from a lost civilization. I think that if there was a lost civilization, it was flowerings of high culture, advanced human behavior going on in different places at different times, and it came together with Göbekli Tepe. I mean, for instance, I'm certain that a lot of these ideas in technology came out of the east, from the area of Siberia, and probably go back to the very beginning of the Upper Paleolithic Age, from about 40 to 45,000 years ago, and were probably inherited from a distant cousin of Homo sapiens called the Denisovans, who we've only known about within the past 10 years, and who were incredibly advanced. I mean, they may have ridden horses, they were producing the most incredible jewellery, they may well have created the first stone structures, and I think that they had the first flowerings of civilization, anything between 60 and 40,000 years ago, and a lot of these ideas were passed on, and that there were then waves coming out of Siberia, which is where their main, base was, coming into Europe, and these waves all created their own flowerings of civilization. I mean, one of the people I'm particularly interested in are the Solutreans. Now, these were peoples who lived in Central and Western Europe from about 20,000 BC through to about 15,000 BC. They too almost certainly rode horses. They created the first stone structures, the first stone tombs and graves. They created the most beautiful stone weapons and tools of the Paleolithic Age. I mean, they almost look like Swarovski crystals more than just functional tools.
Wow.
And they had a mindset that was just extraordinary, and I can link them with the founders of Göbekli Tepe as well.
Well, one of the questions that always strikes me in these ancient sites like Göbekli Tepe and Pumapunku, which rank among some of the oldest sites that we have ever discovered, and yet this stonework at these sites are so advanced. Even Göbekli Tepe with the excuse me, got a little something in my throat. The tall columns shaped like the humans with the fingers wrapping around, and and the artwork of the animals. But you know what? Nobody just learns that overnight. You have to have skilled masons, stonemasons, and artisans. So where is the earlier works? Where is the places that they started on and got better and better before a site like Göbekli Tepe, yet which seems to spring out advanced out of the ground?
Well, it's a double-edged sword, really, because, I mean, there probably are examples around the world, but we just haven't credited them with a great age. So in other words, we're looking at something that is far older, but because it's out of context or it wasn't found during a archaeological dig or something, we're not looking at something that's 11, 12, 15,000 years old. We think it's much younger. But if you look in Western Europe, for instance, between 15 and 20,000 BC, the Solutreans were creating decorated stone slabs with stone relief and also 3D, just like at Göbekli Tepe, and they were setting them up inside caves in France and in Spain as stone sanctuaries, and these are remarkable. Plus, they were creating some of the earliest cave art as well, which has cosmological themes that probably go back tens of thousands of years, even by their age. This is, as I said, minimum of 15,000 BC. Now, before now, people have not been able to link the Solutreans with the Göbekli Tepe builders, but I can. and I can do it through a intermediary culture known as the Swiderians, who were again highly advanced, what they call complex hunter-gatherers that existed in Central and Eastern Europe, and again had the same type of stone tool techniques as Solutreans. They were also the first miners. They created the first deep cast mines, open cast mines, and other types of mine shafts. They mined exotic different types of materials, and they would transport them across many hundreds of kilometers, possibly even thousands. You know, the same culture that's found in Poland, for instance, is almost identical to cultures in the Ukraine and in central Russia. I mean, it's almost identical. It's as if the same tools were made by the same people. You know, these were the first cosmopolitan people, and there's no question that they reached southeast Anatolia and they triggered the founding of places like Gobeckli Tepi. Now, we haven't got all the pieces, of course we haven't, and it may well be that there were other influences that were coming to bear on Gobeckli Tepi, possibly from the south, from the Levant, the so-called Natufian culture, and Graham Hancock, for instance, he suggests that some of the influences were coming in from Southeast Asia. All these are possible, but the end result was Gobeckli Tepi itself, and in many ways this kick-started, you know, our own civilization, our own human civilization. But all of these ideas, as you say, I'm going to be trying to pull together in the next book, The Cygnus Key, which is out next year. And what it shows is that the thread throughout the whole of the Upper Paleolithic, right the way through, not just to the building of Göbekli Tepe, but beyond that, into the construction of the pyramids at Giza, is the same cosmology, the same ideas about the sky world, the origins of life, what happens to the soul in death, and whereabouts this is. And the key seems to be the constellation of Cygnus. This was seen to be the source of life and creation in the universe. I mean, as to why that was, it's manifold. But one of the obvious reasons is that at certain times, the stars of Cygnus correspond with what's known as the northern celestial pole, the place of the pole star. And this was always seen as the point of exit of our own physical world and the entry into some kind of sky world or astral world or heaven, as Christians would one day come to call it.
The Göbekli Tepe in itself is just, it's so fascinating to see. And with those top stone T blocks, do you get the impression that they used to be covered in some way by maybe a wooden roof or a structure? Or do you think those blocks stood free themselves for some symbolic structures?
I think it was probably both. I mean, if you look at the tops of the stones, there are impressions where poles have been placed, but only on some of them. But we don't know whether they were roofs or whether they were like poles that would have hung banners, flags, things like that. But they're not uniform. It's not as if they were created at the time of the manufacture of the stones. It's like it's an afterthought, which tends to suggest that it was probably not part of the original design. And it's my belief, and this is only my opinion, is that there were roofs, but they were only temporary. In other words, they had some kind of wooden infrastructure over the top, but that these roofs were probably made of skin and that they could be rolled down and removed, at certain times of year or for certain rituals, and then covered up at times of extreme weather conditions. That's my feeling to do with it. That makes some kind of sense.
What do you think was the time scale of usage? I mean, how long was the site actually in use for? Have you any ideas at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's we can pin it down almost to a sort of century, really. I mean, it looks like the very first structures were put up, and by the way, when I say the first, I mean these were the most impressive, the largest and the most impressive structures, the most complete, were created around 9600 BC. And they then carried on building them, probably anything between 20 and 50 structures on the top of this low mountain ridge, within an area of something like about 300 by about 200 meters, and gradually building up a sort of layer cake that went up to about 15 to 20 meters in total. In other words, they would construct one enclosure, then they would shut it down maybe after 100 years, couple hundred years, and then build another one either on top of that or to the side of it. And very gradually they built up this mound, which we obviously call today Gobeckli Tepi, which means the hill of the navel, or the hill of the pot belly, or something like that in Turkish. And this is what they were doing, and we've only uncovered just a small percentage of them. But as I said, we're dealing with a time frame probably between about 9,600 BC and 8,000 BC. So that's 1,600 years. Probably give and take half a century. That's probably about absolutely accurately right.
I don't suppose you can probably answer this question, but do you have any notion as to why it was ceased being used, why they abandoned it?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously different schools of thought. I mean, some people believe that there was another cataclysm, and they felt that they had to cover them over to protect them, or maybe to preserve them to the future. Maybe there was some information carved on the stone that they wanted to preserve for future generations. That's possible, but the more logical and to be honest, probably the more mundane answer is that towards the end of their time at Gobeckli Tepi, the structures that they were building were getting smaller and smaller and more simpler. And instead of them being, sort of something like 20, 30 meters across, huge, great structures with, at least 12 outer stones, 3 meters tall, with ones in the middle 5.5 meters in height. By the end of it, they were building tiny little room-like structures, no bigger than your own, house bathroom, that look almost like little mini jacuzzis, basically, with little benches around the outside of them, with maybe one, maybe two little tiny stones. Some carving still on them, and it was almost like they were going through the motions, as if, a little bit like if Christianity hadn't have been pushed. It's like, you got your great cathedrals, the basilicas of 500 to 1000 AD, and if Christianity hadn't have been pushed, probably people would have continued to build churches and chapels, but they'd have got more and more simpler, and eventually people would have said, well, why is it that we orientate them towards the east? Why is it that we have a cross in them? And eventually they'd say, I don't think I could be bothered to do this anymore. We'll just move on, basically. And I think that that's what happened at Gobeckli Tepi, that there was no longer any need to construct these enclosures any longer. And I think that, as I mentioned earlier, the original reason for creating them was as almost like these portals, or stargates, if you like, interfaces between this world and the next, where the shamans could easily access the sky world to deal with the supernatural forces that they believed were responsible for these cataclysms. And this suggests that there wasn't any further cataclysms after about 9,600 BC, not big ones at least anyway, and that by about 8,000 BC everything had gone quiet and everybody thought they might as well just move on now.
Well, a lot of it, it seems that also knowledge seems to die off when people die off and things aren't being passed down. I know Robert Forster, in his Brian Forster, in his research through a lot of these megalithic sites, especially down in South America with the Inca, He's seen how the older the structures, the more advanced the technology, and then over time it gets, like you said with Göbekli Tepe, it gets more simple and simple until finally it's back to what we would consider the primitives, taking small rocks and mortaring them together and putting it up. They lost those skills that they used to have.
Yes, they've lost the skills, but why have they lost the skills? Because they've lost the impetus to actually do it. And I think that's it. And also, remember, you probably got changing religious ideals as well. Because with the introduction of the Neolithic Revolution, the first interest in the veneration of the sun begins. Because the sun becomes the most important celestial body in the sky, because you need it to ripen your crops if you have agriculture. So you're going to be hoping and praying every winter that the sun is going to return its strength in the spring. So suddenly the sun becomes the center of your attention, whereas up to this time the main focus had been stars. The movement of the stars, their positions, their relationship to the turning point of the heavens, and also the moon. The moon was unquestionably the most important celestial body up to the time of the Neolithic Revolution. But afterwards, it starts getting marginalised as far as its uses. Yes, it's still used for things like, calendrical, timekeeping, and probably also as a representation of a deity associated with water and femininity and various other things. But it loses the potency it had prior to that time, as the sun god now begins to rise in dominance. And I think that this is something that continues to take place. So in other words, a lot of the old ideals of magic to do with the stars and the moon were no longer needed. And this probably caused schisms, that some people that wanted to continue to follow the old ways went off and did their own thing at new sites, which almost certainly happened at Göbekli Tepe. There's another site called Karahan Tepe, which is about 30-odd miles away from Göbekli Tepe, which seems to be the continuance of what was earlier going on at Göbekli Tepe, including the interest in the stars and the moon. Whereas at Göbekli Tepe itself, all of the later enclosures were all directed towards the sun, and they were all aligned roughly east-west, where all the earlier structures were roughly, north or just off of north or just off of south, to look at stars in those directions.
So what do you think made the change? Why they shifted away from the stars to the moon and sun?
Well, you see, this is the big question that, why did the Neolithic Revolution take place? And what is the Neolithic Revolution? Well, it was the introduction of agriculture and the sudden emergence of cities, and urban centres that changed everything. And previously, people like V. Gordon Childe, the great prehistorian of the 20th century, said that what happened was that you had hunter-gatherers, they discovered agriculture, they started to have this new lifestyle that gave them time on their hands, so they started to ponder upon life, the universe and everything. They started to construct urban centres to try and deal with it, and also the first temples. But now we know that that's completely wrong. Now we know that the temples, the sanctuaries, the enclosures where they would do their rituals, the ceremonies, came first, and that these got larger and larger, and they would have had to involve hundreds, if not thousands, of people, either in their maintenance or the construction. At places like Göbekli Tepe, I mean, this was massive urban building project, basically, which would have involved so many hundreds and thousands of people, and they would all need to be fed. And there's only a certain amount of natural resources in the area that you could exploit over, decades, and eventually hundreds of years. And I think what happened was that some bright spark came along and said, hold on, what about those experiments we did a while back with that thing called wheat. Couldn't we get that out again and see if we can generate some food that way? And that I think is what happened. They turned to agriculture to feed all of the people that were beginning to gather around these centres, because they had no other way of feeding them, or certainly not as far as exploiting the local resources of game, the different gazelles and bulls and oxes and whatever else that they were exploiting at that time. And that, I think, is what happened. And this itself acted like a magnet that drew other people towards these centres, and very gradually you had the building of the first cities or first town complexes, like, for instance, Çatalhöyük in southern central Turkey, and eventually, obviously, you got places like Jericho in the Palestinian territories, what is today, and this is your first cities, and this is how it really began, really.
The one thing that gets me is we have in our mythology tales of very advanced human civilizations going back far before recorded history. We have tales of Atlantis or Lemuria. And while most people look at these as being fables, these civilizations are said to have been extremely advanced for the time, not only traveling the world, but having very high technology. Now, again, these places have never been found, yet we do have locations around the world like Gobeckli Tepi that seem to indicate a more advanced style of building and structures. Now, let me ask your thoughts, because I know people have differing opinions, but do you believe that we had, and taking the ancient alien aspect out of it, not like thinking of the alien aspect, but do you feel that maybe we may have had more advanced human civilizations on this planet that we just haven't found enough evidence for yet, that may have existed, instead of the linear coming, from cavemen, hunter-gatherers, and then they start building small cities, big cities, a nice even linear progression to modern day. I've always got the feeling that we actually have had some fits and starts and maybe even some resets, that maybe we are older than we think we are, and there were more advanced civilizations, but whether because of these natural disasters like the so-called flood or comets or whatnot, may have pretty much hit the reset button for humanity and we had to start all over again, and maybe that's where we lost some of this knowledge along the way. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. I mean, I think that people have to get out of their minds, for the time being at least, the idea of an Atlantis as described by Plato. I mean, he was creating this idealistic city, almost like a utopian city, which he then says became too haughty, and Zeus felt that it was right to destroy it with earthquakes and floods. Now, my research suggests that he was actually basing his account on much earlier traditions to do with the existence of high culture in the area of the Caribbean and the Bahamas, off the American coast. And it may well even be that he heard rumours, and bear in mind he lived around 350 BC, of cities existing probably on the American continent, and that he mixed all these together and created Atlantis. I think that's probably what happened, and that then these stories got transported back from the Caribbean and the Bahamas into the Mediterranean, where they became talking points amongst the sailors and the workers at ports, and they found eventually the ears of Plato, and that's why he wrote about it. So you have to be careful. And then obviously you've got Edgar Cayce, who went into a trance and would come up with his vision of what Atlantis look like, and that they had crystal technologies, and they could create half humans, half animals, and they had incredible technology to do this, that, and the other. I mean, that's all very nice, but we haven't got any archaeological evidence to back that up. We have a few out-of-place artifacts that have been found around the world that just shouldn't be there, so-called UPARTs, as they're known. And we have elements of high culture found in Siberia, which unquestionably are the product of the Denisovans, anything between about 70 and 40,000 years ago. But we haven't got any real monuments that tell us that there was an absolute city-like lost civilization that existed in the past. Not yet. People might point to Gunung Padang in Java, a place that I visited and thoroughly investigated over a period of days, which archaeologists and geologists there have suggested goes back at least 8,000 BC. This is a huge pyramid hill complex, which is an extraordinary place, topped with a megalithic structure. It suggested that this could even be older. And there may be some other places around the world that are very old, but we just don't understand just how old they are. But that's about it. And I think that if there was one big lost civilization in the world, we would find more evidence of it with the stone tools. I mean, the stone tools was the signature of these early Paleolithic cultures. They used them by the thousand. If you go to Gobeckli Tepi, they're all over the place. The closer you get to, when I went there, for instance, the first time in 2004, I walked to Gobeckli Tepi. There was no coaches then. And I walked all across the hills, across the valleys to get there. And the closer you got there, the more stone tools that you saw. And by the time you got there, they were just in piles everywhere. And you get the same thing at Paleolithic sites all the way around the world. And this is a telltale sign of the age of something. I mean, there are mines, for instance, in Zimbabwe of red ochre, where there are literally millions of stone tools and stone tool fragments kicking around everywhere. So you have to be careful, because if somebody claims that a monument is part of a lost civilization and you go there and you do not find any stone tools, treat that claim with skepticism, because you would find stone tools around them. And I've been to many of these sites. Some I can find tools, some I can't. I mean, I've got an eye. I've been collecting these things on and off, since I was a child. And I can tell what activity has gone on at a site, which ages it was used, which periods there was no human activity, just simply by looking around and seeing what I pick up. And so that's it, really. I think you would find more of these stone tools gathered around these sites, if indeed they were as old as some people say. But having said that, they're also markers, they're also clues. They tell us that Göbekli Tepe is as old as it is. They tell us various other sites are as old as what they are. So this is what we should be looking for, the trail of tools, basically.
There are other stories around the world. And again, I know that physical evidence is hard to come by, but like when you look at the Indian epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata, I can't pronounce it, but they talk about the advanced technology, and it all sounds very fanciful for readers. It sounds like pure fantasy and mythology, and yet there are a lot of things that they talk about in these epic poems about, these Vimana, these cities flying, these mass weapons that sound dramatically like possible nuclear weapons. And then there have been sites found in that region that have shown radioactivity. So it still seems like there may have been, and again, we have to say may because we don't have any direct evidence, may have been some types of advanced cultures, whether they were human cultures, whether maybe they weren't human, we don't know, that existed back in those days.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think that you're probably referring to things like the Indus Valley culture, sort of Mohenjo-Daro and
yes,
Harappa,
Mohenjo-Daro, yes,
where you've got this evidence of a lot of people dying very quickly, and it seems as if the soil has been melted, and there's no absolute reason for this. Fires probably wouldn't have caused that amount of these tiny melt fragments, basically, which you get at places like the Trinity site where the first atomic bomb went off. I have no doubt that there was high technology in the past, but if you look at something like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, they only really go back to maybe earliest 5000 BC. That's well within our civilization. And it may well be that they were throwing around terrible weapons at each other at this time, which is obviously what we read about in a lot of the Vedic texts. And I don't think they should be discounted at all. The stories in there of the Vimanas or the Vimanas, whatever you want to pronounce them, these flying machines that they had are so detailed in in how they were constructed, the fuel that was used, how many people piloted them and whatever. I don't think we should discount that. But on the other hand, as you pointed out earlier, we haven't got any hard evidence of this, but it shouldn't stop us looking for it.
So do you think there are examples of very ancient civilizations of the kind we're talking about here that we've yet to uncover? There are sites like Gobeckli Tepi, for example, that are elsewhere that we've yet to uncover.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I do believe that we will find more and more as the years go by. And I think that a lot of it's to do with our own mindset, really. We were brought up in an age that still, was still very biblically orientated. The idea that civilization began in 4000 BC, Noah was kicking around 2500 BC, and everything came from that. Well, we've broken all of those barriers now, and we know that Gobeckli Tepi shows that there was high culture in 9500 BC. And now we can look for that type of evidence elsewhere, and we will find it now. It's a little bit like the dinosaurs. I mean, dinosaur bones were around everywhere, and people picked them up, and they had their own interpretations of what they were. But it wasn't until somebody started to realise that these were the fossilised bones of extremely large reptiles that that roamed the earth 65 million years ago and plus, that we started to really get to grips on their existence and the fact you could find these all over the planet. Up to that point, it's almost like there was a blind eye to them, really, just in the same way that when the first boats turned up off the coast of the Bahamas in the late 15th century with Christopher Columbus on board, the natives didn't even see the boats. They couldn't see the boats. They just did not understand what they were. And it's the same thing, I think, that the more we accept and believe, I know that's an interesting word, belief, but the more we do believe that there was a lost civilization, the more we will uncover, the more we will find it.
That's always been a thing I found fascinating, the idea of the American natives who didn't even see the boats, they couldn't even recognise the form because it was something they'd never encountered. So I certainly get the analogy there of these things are around without us really understanding what they are. Where's the best place to go to hear more about these sorts of subjects, Andrew? Is there anything coming up in the near future we could be talking about?
There is indeed. In November, on Saturday the 4th of November, Sunday the 5th, there is what's known as Origins, or Origin 17, a big event in London, a conference of a whole number of people involved with the ancient mysteries subject, authors, speakers, researchers. People get together. It's at Steiner House, which is near Paddington, and there are a number of speakers. Let me just run through them if I can. We've got Alan Butler, who is the co-author of the book Civilization 1, that showed that the megalithic culture had this very specific geometry and measurements and mathematics to do with all of their sites that was universal and probably came from a lost civilization. We have Lynn Picnic and Clive Prince, two of the most famous investigative historians in the world. They did books like The Templar Revelation and The Stargate Conspiracy, which is what they should be talking about, which is essentially all about the hidden agendas behind the re-emergence of the ancient Egyptian civilization having a greater antiquity. And also the book shows how at the back of all of this somewhere were these communications going on between various different people in high places and scientists and producers and all the rest of it, with these supposed ETI, intelligences who called themselves the Nine. And these were incredibly influential, these communications. I mean, they went on to influence NASA flights. They went on to influence, science fiction in Star Trek. A lot of the ideas ended up in Star Trek. And also in the different future technologies which were being developed and still being developed today. All of these originally were spurred on by these weird communications, but this is the story that they're going to be telling. We've got Jim Vieira from the United States, who's going to be talking all about Edgar Cayce, and showing that everything that he said about the lost civilization is coming true. We've got Michael Cremo. Now, his book was, is a worldwide, best-selling cult classic, which is Forbidden Archaeology. And what he shows is that there were anatomically modern humans many millions of years before what the archaeologists or paleoarchaeologists actually tell us, and that they left evidence of their existence in different parts of the globe, and that this has been denied, by mainstream science, and very gradually we're realizing that this is correct. And we now know, for instance, that there were upright hominids walking around Europe around 7 million years ago. They were in Bulgaria, they were in Greece. Recently, evidence of footprints that date back to over 5 million years old have been found in Crete. So all of these old paradigms are being shattered, and Michael Cremo is being proved correct. So I hope everybody, stands up and gives him a round of applause at the end, basically. And you've got my colleague Hugh Newman, who's the co-organizer of it. He is going to be talking about this giant race or giant population that existed. Now, he's already done one relating to the giants in America. This time he's doing the giants in Britain. He'll show that there are many different stories in archaeological journals and books of the discovery of giant bones in this country, and we'll tie this together with all the legends and mythology to do with the giants and show that almost certainly they did exist as a population in their own right in the past. And myself, my lecture's called Meet the Denisovans, the True Founders of Human Civilization. The Denisovans are going to be very, very big in the future. Graham Hancock at this very moment is in Siberia at a place called the Denisova Cave, which is where the anatomical evidence of the Denisovans has been found. And they were big. They would seem to have been the real giants of history. And it looks like they gifted us human civilization, or gave our civilization, its boost at the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic Age. And then at the end of the day, I shall be talking about another great mystery at the moment, which is Tabby's star. It's this star in the constellation of Cygnus, which has been giving out these very weird mathematical patterns that suggest that there may be some kind of ETI involved. Others have suggested there may be even some kind of alien megastructure orbiting around there. And I'm going to be using that as a focus for a guided meditation at the end of the day. We're actually going to be trying to sort of go to the star, which should be quite fun. So that's about it. That's as I said, that's Origin 17. For those interested in coming along, go onto my website, which is andrewcollins.com, www.andrewcollins.com. You can get all the information there. And that's probably the next big event. And beyond that, we'll see.
Well,
I, for one, I'm certainly looking forward to being there, Andrew. Really looking forward to it. It should be a good day.
yeah, I'm ready to get my tickets to come over to London and attend. It sounds like a great conference. And Andrew, I know we're out of time for you, but I wanted to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an extreme pleasure talking with you today. And just want to remind everybody to go out to Andrew's website. His books are available on Amazon.com, Amazon.co.uk. And Andrew, thank you again. We really appreciate you being here.
That's my pleasure.
Well, Andy, that was a really fascinating conversation with Andrew Collins.
Absolutely, yes. It's quite amazing for me, actually. I've known Andy from his earlier writings with the psychic questing material, which is obviously working with psychics, exploring the local landscape. And then when he was running the EarthQuest group, which I was involved in writing those books, he basically closed the group down and said he was working on a new book, and it was taking so much time that he really wanted to dedicate his time to the book, and that was Ashes of Angels. And it was such an enormous departure in terms of stylistically, content, and to be honest, in many ways, the quality of the work. He was always a great writer, very engaging. You always felt he was actually involved in the adventures they were having. But the information, the wealth of information in Ashes of Angels absolutely blew me away, and I thought, wow, this has become serious work. I'm very, very impressed. I know his big thing has in the last recent time been the Gobeckli Tepi work, because he was one of the real pioneers of getting that name out there. In fact, as Andrew mentioned, we're both good friends of a guy called Richard Ward, who's been on my show a few times, and he was telling me about Andrew's sort of working on the Tepi stuff, and I was like, wow, he's really that old, and not being able to believe it. But then when Richard showed me more of it, and then Andy's book came out, I was like absolutely amazed. It really is interesting stuff. So yeah, it was great to have him on the show.
Oh, fantastic. And, we do have another guest coming up here in a minute, but we are also now rejoined by the host of Paranormal UK Radio, Irene Allen Block. Very glad you can join us. Now, did your dogs catch the fox in the garden?
No, they haven't yet, but there is something strange going on around this house.
What are they doing?
Definitely strange.
I like strange.
They're very, very jumpy. All of them are very, very jumpy. They keep going up in the air, and I'm not sure whether to open the door and let them out or what.
Well, you know what this time of year is, don't you? Isn't this usually the time of year?
It's the Tremor time.
Yeah, the Tremor usually comes out and start traipsing around your back garden. This is one of the reasons
why I don't want to open the door. I don't want to be coming face to face and having to have another conversation with the Tremor, do I?
Well, you should.
Why?
How else are you going to learn anything? If it were me, I'd be out that door right now looking for the Tremor. So which one of us is the more dedicated investigator?
Well, if I want to go out there and talk to them, or if I go out there and talk to them, whatever intelligent stuff they come out with, I'm going to just be talking shopping. You know that.
Yeah, I could see Irene sitting there with a Welsh Bigfoot sitting right in front of her, and her talking about going all this online shopping she's got,
from.
asking advice on what kind of raised dog bowls she can get for her dogs.
Yeah, I've been trying to get them all day. So anyway, what's going on? What have you been up to? I've been away for a couple of weeks now, and relaxing a bit. Yeah,
getting everything back in. Well, now we're back.
Well, no, I've not been relaxing. I've been very, very busy. I have been busy.
You have been
networking and one thing or another. But
weeding the goblins out of your garden.
Yeah.
Yep.
Getting rid of all those goblins.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm
now goblin free. You know that, don't you?
You're certified Goblin free.
Goblin free.
Yep, that's it.
Certified goblin free.
Good riddance. Anyway, well, we have a second hour of show here to do, and we have as our guest one of our newest show hosts, actually, who's just joined the Paranormal UK radio network with his bi-weekly show, the Urban Fantasist. So we want to welcome Charles Christian to the program.
Hi, guys.
Hello, Charles.
Hello.
I'm sorry about the dog bark there.
I don't know what it is, Charles, but when I introduce you, I slip into a British accent.
You slipped into a French one there, yes.
I slip into a coma.
Yeah. How are you, Charles?
I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Your first show Sorry.
No, over to you.
Your first show went out a couple of weeks ago, and it was a great hit. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. Can't wait for the next one. So, Mark, when's the next one out? When's it due?
It actually went out this last Thursday, so the next one will be coming out since it's the first and third Thursdays of every month at 11 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. So the next time people can listen will be next week on October the 5th.
Oh, great.
That's it.
Okay.
Yep. Now, and
forward to it.
Charles, I'm fascinated with the Urban Fantasist title. How did you come up with that?
It's a bit of a throwback to the fiction I write, which is urban fantasy. It's a particular genre I like, the way we have modern day living combined with the supernatural, the preternatural, the paranormal. I just find it intriguing, that element of you're walking down a city street, but just down the corner there might be just something a little bit weird. It might be a ghost, it might be one of the fae, could be anything. And I picked that name for a website, and I've been sticking with it ever since. I say it's actually, the genre is urban fantasy, but I'm the urban fantasist.
And your show is concentrated. Well, you do a number of things with your show, but especially talking about strange stories and legends and other tales. I mean, what made you interested in all of that?
I think I've always been interested in that kind of stuff. I suppose I had the benefit of growing up in, because I'm very, very old, at a time when television wasn't prevalent. So we tended to have, sitting around the fire on a night, either listening to the radio or telling tales. I lived in a spooky old house by the coast in Scarborough that had lots of strange rooms, and you could tell parts of it had been put together from old ship's timbers. And there were various rumours that it was haunted, and that there were passages leading away underneath that smugglers used to use. And there was that whole background. And so I became intrigued with it. But I say not just the ghosts, but the stories behind them. I found intriguing. Why did suddenly someone come up with this story? Someone didn't just sit down and said, I'm going to make up a story about a headless ghost that walks through this wall. There has to be a reason for it, and tracing back the legends behind it, the urban legends, but also how we have the benefit of science on our sides, and we can explain a lot of things. But 100 years ago, to use the old Arthur C. Clarke phrase, there wasn't much difference between magic and science. It was all a mystery to most people, these things that were happening. And it was just that element that's always intrigued me. Behind, however fanciful a myth or a story may be, there is always an element of truth. It may have been changed over the last 1,000, 5,000 years, but there's always an element of truth somewhere behind it.
Yeah, it always gets, they normally get changed as they're being told, don't they, over the years? But like you say, they start somewhere. And if you really dig back, you can find most of it.
Well, exactly. There's always a cause that's, something's been lost in translation along the way. Yeah. And suddenly, several, a few hundred years later, it's been totally transformed and bears little recognition. But I say, just scraping, you can find where the story is. And obviously, the other element is the fact of some stories become so fanciful that I'd heard the dog that time.
Sorry.
That become so fanciful that they become a completely different story. There's a cross on a country lane just near where I live, and it was clearly a memorial to a pilot of some sort. And when I first asked about it, I was told that it was where a Second World War German pilot had been shot down, and the locals had lynched him before the police could get there. And several people told me this was it. But then when you dig back, you find actually it was the First World War. There were two accidents. One was a German pilot who crashed and was killed, and the other, what the cross relates to, was a Canadian pilot who was killed when he maneuvered his plane to avoid crashing into a village and was killed in the process of there. So you have this situation that people are saying, "Oh yeah, it was a Nazi who was lynched," and actually no, it was a good guy who died trying to save other people. And
so it was a hero.
Elements.
He was a hero.
It was a hero, and it's those sides of the stories that deserve telling, because so often they get lost. And obviously, with the internet age we live in, stories start spreading on social media, and everybody believes them. This is the whole, fake news scenario, and it becomes the mantra, and it becomes true, and everybody says, "Yeah, this is a fact." And then you say, "Well, no, because 20 years ago, before there was Wikipedia, if you looked it up, you'd have found out what the real story was." So I say, I find that the fascinating side.
It's interesting, actually, Charles, you talk about that, because it's something I also find very fascinating, how internet stories can sort of leak into the real world. And one particular one I've been following quite closely over a number of years now is the story of the Slender Man, which has become very much, I suppose, the real kind of evil creature that lurks in the woods, that began totally as an internet creation in 2009, completely made up from those creepypasta sites, and yet it's leaked into the general environment to the point you had those two girls, didn't you, in America, took some other girl into the woods, tried to sort of cut her to summon the Slender Man, and it's quite horrendous what's happening when these sorts of things begin to occur, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a classic case of life following fiction. And I mean, that story is now going to get a further boost because they're starting the procedure in the States for sentencing the girls. I think one of them has already been sentenced to be detained indefinitely in a mental asylum. Yes. But there's still the other one who's still waiting for her sentencing. And of course, that's going to keep the story alive a lot longer.
Absolutely. Of course, the other side of that, I don't know if you've seen, there's been a little bit of a battle with copyright ownership. In fact, they're trying to decide whether someone can own the copyright over something like the Slender Man because it's been specifically invented, or if that is something you cannot copyright. And I thought an interesting side of it was, if the courts do rule that it's copyrightable material, then it completely blows the whole notion of it being anything other than a made-up story. But it is one of those ones that, as I say, it kind of keeps moving forward. In that particular case, I didn't realise was actually going through the courts at the moment. But I mean, a good example of where people adapt stories to fit other stories. One of the places I've investigated on many occasions is a place called Woodchester Mansion down in Gloucestershire. One of the ghost stories, if you like, of Woodchester includes the sighting of a tall figure in possibly in a top hat that's been seen in one of the rear corridors of the building on a number of occasions. Now, that's been sighted there. I mean, it first began being investigated in about the year 2000. Before then, it wasn't, and that was on one of the second ever investigations around the year 2000. Up until fairly recently, it was always described as being a tall figure, perhaps in a top hat, but a man seen in the corridor, or the shadow of a man. Recently, I've heard people describing it as being an example of a slender man, and I was absolutely blown away. And I thought, no, this has been around long before that story came up, but it shows how it's leaked into the general psyche, if you like, of the idea of the slender man, and I was really quite surprised at that. I also think Doctor Who, the TV series, didn't exactly help, because you had the silence, which, in all intents and purposes, in their appearance, was the slender man, and I thought, well, that's...
Oh, I remember them.
Well, Steve Moffat just borrowed the idea, basically. He was quite
the
candid
slender
about how
man
it
with
came
the
about.
big heads.
Yeah.
Sorry?
I said they were slender men with big heads.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So that one down at Woodchester Mansion is a typical example of how things change when the story gets told them.
Absolutely, yeah. It's been adapted. Someone's adapted that into it, and it's been repeated on more than one occasion now. And it's quite hilarious, really. Well, it's like it was been seen at least since the year 2000, before the Slender Man was even invented. Therefore, there's not a Slender Man at all, because it's a made story.
Well, another example are the black-eyed children.
Oh, yes.
I mean, again, that's a relatively new thing. And now whenever a ghost is seen, it's a black-eyed child, and there's a few standard images the newspapers use to depict it. And that's the same. That's come from nowhere.
Absolutely. I mean, well, one of the things I've found... Go ahead, sorry, Charles.
Yep, sorry. No, over to you.
Well, I was just going to say, I've written a book which is coming out later on this year, which is a collection. It might interest you, actually, Charles, from what you were saying before. It's a collection of charms and spells and incantations from rural Britain across the country. They are taken mainly from Victorian-dated folklore books that the Folklore Society published, and they published hundreds of them, quite literally, lots of ones in different counties. And, excuse me... One of the things I noticed, obviously, as well as looking for the charms and spells themselves, were all the ghost stories, the legends, the myths, the stories that you would find. And things like Slender Men, Black-Eyed Kids, all those sort of things just did not occur at all. No mention of them whatsoever. So you are left with thinking, well, if they've been around for a long time, no one's ever talked about them until now. So you're left with the conclusion, well, that's because someone made them up fairly recently, and yet they've spread. And when you say to people who believe these things exist, well, why is there like zero evidence for them in the past, other than until 5-10 years ago, or pre-internet days? And there's not really an answer. But it's that amorphous kind of, we see something paranormal and strange, we tend to put our own ideas into it as to what we think we're witnessing. And if you have Slender Man, for example, or Black-Eyed Children in your mind, that's what you tend to see, because that's almost what you're looking for, because it fits your belief system.
Exactly. And your belief system will not your individual belief system, but belief systems change over time.
Absolutely.
And my parents' generation had a different belief system, and I suspect the type of ghosts they talked about were entirely different to the ones me and my friends talked about, and are entirely different to what young people today would be talking about.
Very much so. Again, a friend of mine, John Killico James, has done some research into the folklore of ghosts, and what he noticed, and speaking to him a little while ago, I was speaking at a conference actually, the way in which ghosts were described, even as late as sort of Victorian times, were very different to how we see them now. The kind of sorry, I do apologise. The kind of imagery that we have in the modern mind of a ghost's appearance and what they're supposed to be doing, what they're about, is quite different to what sort of further time back were. And again, our ideas about what ghosts are have developed and changed along with our society's developed and changed. So very much it is part of your own individual thinking, but also of the kind of group mind, if you like, the idea of society. That also has meant that these entities, these creatures, whatever you want to call them, how much they have appeared to have changed. And I always find myself thinking, well, maybe they haven't changed, it's just our perception of them has changed according to our belief systems and the times we're living in.
Yeah, and I mean, if you go even further back to sort of the Middle Ages, when you're reading the chronicles of that time, William of Newburgh and people like that, he's heavily into revenants, where they're not what we now imagine as ghosts. They're more what we'd class as zombies or vampires. They are physical creatures that are coming back from the dead, as opposed to merely the spirits of them.
That's exactly what John was talking about. You couldn't remember the term. I was struggling to remember it. Yes, that's exactly what he was saying. The same thing. Yeah, definitely.
Well, you're there, Andy.
Yeah.
Can I have a go now? Yeah, I know you're suffering. You poor thing. He's loaded up with a cold. What I was going to say, Charles, is the spells that you bring into your show. Where did you get this idea from? It's fascinating.
The idea behind this show is that it's a magazine show, as opposed to, a series of short pieces. And I wanted to do something date or time oriented with it. So, one of the things we do is more or less your ghost tonight, which ghost is walking around this particular night that coincides with the show. But I also was thinking about the magical lore, and again, that's another area I've always been intrigued with, the whole witchcraft, Wicca, pagan magic side of things. And I thought, well, it'd be quite good actually to have some spells, because I haven't, there are various books of spells about, but I hadn't actually heard anyone doing that. And I thought that would be quite intriguing. And I know from when we were recording the show, a couple of people who were working on the tapes were saying, "God, our girlfriends will love this. They're really into this sort of stuff." I think there's an interest in it, and I'm going to continue doing that. I think it's sorry. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say it's more Andy's thing, this as well. So,
have you listened to my shows, Charles? The Nameless Art list. You really should.
I will do. I will listen to the Nameless Art. Yes.
Well, it's the one that's up at the moment is the one between shows. As my show and format and area or topic are changing. My new show, which starts next month, is called Radio Hermetica, which is predominantly going to be about magic, witchcraft, the occult, all those kind of topics. The first two,
brilliant.
And can be heard on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Absolutely, advertised at all times, and on YouTube now as well. And the first two shows are two-parters covering the conference at which I co-hosted and spoke at back in September, or still in September, beginning of the month, I should say. It's based all around traditional witchcraft, and as I say, the book I have got coming out from Three Hands Press later in the year would be right up your street, because it's full of genuine spells, incantations, and charms from rural Britain. They were gathered during the Victorian age, but they go back centuries, are much older than that as well. So I think you'll find that quite interesting as well. So have a listen to my show, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, where I am living out here in East Anglia, this is sort of one of the last areas where we used to still have the cunning men and cunning women, who were the sort of, I don't really call them hedge witches, but
you better explain the cunning. Sorry, Charles, you better explain the cunning men and the cunning women. I'm losing my voice now.
Right.
What is this? Is this the show of the walking wounded? I've got a bad cough. Andy's sick. Irene's losing her voice and about to fall over. How are you feeling, Charles?
Well, 48 hours ago, I had something unmentionable, so I won't get into that.
Tell us later. Listen, Charles. Charles, can you explain the cunning men? Oh, sorry, Andy. The cunning men and cunning women.
Are you familiar with James Murrell, the cunning man? James Murrell.
Yes.
Charles.
Yes. Not obviously familiar with him.
Not personally. Yes. Well, he lived about 10 miles from where I live. I live in southern Essex, and he's from Leigh-on-Sea, just down the road from me. And fascinating chap, certainly. But you go ahead and you explain what cunning men are. So,
well, I think you're equally qualified to talk on it. But essentially, they were local practitioners, freelance practitioners of magic arts, and they would be contacted, asked to do various assignments for their local village, local areas. Sometimes it would be just something like predicting the weather for harvest and things like that, and storms for fishermen. There was quite a lot of use of them trying to find lost goods, whether things had been lost or were stolen. And then they would also move over to casting spells. The general view is that they were more white magicians than anything else. Mm-hmm. But it was a sort of a long tradition, again, going back hundreds of years, because, well, rather like the roots of witchcraft and the fact that many of the herbal remedies that we now have in pharmaceuticals, people in those days were using, but they didn't quite know the scientific reason why, but they knew that if you chewed on this type of wood, it gave something off that helped ease toothache. And so if you had toothache, you'd call the local cunning man or cunning woman, and hey, you chew on this bit of this and it'll make you feel okay. And they just had that local knowledge. And it was at a time when there was no formal health service, and a lot of the doctors were essentially quacks who would just bleed you. In fact, I've got a book somewhere on that where there's a quote saying you were safer in the hands of a cunning man than you were of a medical practitioner. You know, the medical practitioner would probably kill you and take all your money. The cunning man, there's a good chance he'd cure you, and he wouldn't take as much money.
He was more in his interest to ensure that you survive. But certainly, as you say, there was, whatever the problem, bleeding was always thought to be the cure. You know, if there's some malady of the blood, therefore you need to drain it. It's like most of the time, that's the last thing you should be doing is bleeding somebody, certainly. But as you absolutely say, the problem was there was no real health service at all. But again, try to keep going back to my book, one of the things I noticed was any malady, any problem, anything that was untoward that happened in the village, it was always the witch down the end of the road that would get the blame for it, and which we know, obviously, historically speaking, is how the witch trials occurred. But a lot of the cunning men kind of made their business, if you like, defeating the spells of the witch, trying to reverse the bad curse that she may or may not have placed. I mean, there are examples of people actually inventing the stories of the local witch for the cunning man to come in and make a few quid, you know, basically pay someone to say this, then other people would claim they've had that experience, and the cunning man comes along with his toolbox to fix the problem. So, but again, on the other side of that, as you say, the herbalists, absolutely. I mean, Cunning Merrill himself had a copy of Culpeper's herbal from the period of the Elizabethan times, and a little later, and had lots of additional notes he'd made himself, in fact apparently correcting some of the things that Culpeper had said from his own work and experience. So James clearly was an intelligent man and did know what he was doing. He was certainly having a positive effect, definitely. So they are absolutely fascinating people, certainly.
Yeah.
Charles, I have to ask, you know, you research all of these tales, but have you had any of your own strange or paranormal experiences?
Well, that's the sad thing. I was the original teenage ghost hunter, and I've looked all over the places. Now, I used to do it when I was at university and camp out in graveyards, wait on the night of a ghost, waiting to see it, and never seen anything. I'm sad to say. I've occasionally been somewhere and I've had the sort of a cold shiver down my spine that makes me think I don't want to look behind me. But I've never actually had an actual, but I put my hand on my heart, a supernatural experience.
Not even in that house you were living in?
The nearest to that was the bed used to shake in an odd way. And my parents always told me it was the wind hitting the house, but it did feel a sensation as if someone was grabbing the bottom of the bed. But there was nothing. And I say we did have an aunt who used to stay with us, who used to say she could hear the sound of the ghosts of seamen in their large boots clumping around in the attics, because there were some attic rooms which a few generations previously had been used for shipwrecked sailors to stay in while they were being recovering. But no, I have to say, not. Very, very sad.
Well, I don't think it'd be the wind hitting the house that was shifting your bed. Not really.
No, I say it was. I know. I said, "Well, what's with the bed, Dad?" And he said, "Oh, it's just the wind hitting the side of the house." And it was a few years later, well, many years later, and it suddenly dawned on me, but where the wind hits the house is not the side that would have shaken my bed anyway. It was coming from the wrong direction. But I'm afraid when things like that come along, my reaction is to hide under the bed with my eyes shut, especially when you're 10 years old.
Yeah, well, my father used to say silly things like that to me as well, just to put me at ease about various things. They always come out with some excuse, don't they? I do the same now with my grandchildren, so things don't change.
Well, look really at how often have you heard me complain on the show how nothing happens to me, and yet when you take the time and really take a hard look at events that happen in your life, lots of things happened. When I started making a list of all the things that I've experienced in my life, it's way stranger than I realized. But we're so trained to blow it off. Especially if you have parents that say it's your imagination. Oh, you just had a dream. Forget about it. Stop screwing around.
Accept it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just accept it. It's natural over here in these British Isles anyway, isn't it? So everybody grows up with it. You don't it doesn't register with you because it's just, so much of it happens. I believe that's what it is. It becomes part of normal life to us. So,
yes. And again, you get cold spots in houses. Well, the house I used to live in,
especially old houses,
cold spots. But it was an old house and it was damp. And there were parts you went past and it was cold because there was damp coming through. So you think, well, there's a natural explanation for that. Just move along.
Yeah, that's true. Sorry about that binging noise just now. My computer has again told me I should go to bed. So, and I don't know how to stop it doing that. It does it quite a lot.
Is your computer called Hal by any chance?
I'm afraid I can't do that, Irene.
Just step out of the airlock, Irene.
Yeah.
Daisy.
Oh, anyway, carry on, boys. I've got to go and get something. I'm laughing too much now.
Echo really what Mark was saying before about you have experiences that you may dismiss as being, just that was whatever. But sometimes when you think back and reflect upon it, you think, well, hang on a minute, that was a little bit strange. I've been involved in a couple of different paranormal events companies, organising events for the public. And there have been quite a few occasions when you've had usually the husband or the male partner of the female person who wants to be on the event, if you like. They come along because they're the driver. They've kind of got to be there because their wife, girlfriend wants to be there. And they'll come at the end and say, I don't really believe in ghosts, but I saw that. That was a bit strange, that. I wasn't really a real experience for me, but, that was odd. You think, well, make your mind up if you did or you didn't. I'll just quickly tell you a little story, actually, of an example of exactly that, which I occasionally tell. One of the companies I worked with did visit Woodchester Mansion, I mentioned before, regularly on lots of occasions. And we used to meet the group that were coming for the night in the local pub. I forget the name of the pub now, but it's just literally up the road. But I used to like to kind of mingle in and just be as if I was one of the punters, not mention the fact that I was working for the company. I was actually involved in the event, just to gauge people's ideas and their thoughts and feelings on stuff. And we sat with a couple. There were two women and the two husbands. One of the husbands was into it. The other one wasn't interested at all. And she was ribbing a bit, saying he's only here because he's got the car. And the bloke was, I don't really believe in this kind of stuff. You use a different word. And, but, I've come along for it. And then when we got to the location and I went out to do a bit of a talking about what we do with equipment, he was a bit sheepish and a bit embarrassed. And I said to him afterwards, don't worry, mate. People say that. You're not offended, not bothered. You believe what or you don't believe. Now, during that particular night, there was a dry thunderstorm, just the thunder and the lightning, but no rain. And we were on a first floor corridor. And I kid you not, every flash of light, you could see a figure at the far end of the corridor. And it was literally the flash of light. Everyone would go, "Oh, what's that?" And it was there. There's no two ways about it. There was something standing there. Again, obviously, you see it in a fraction of a second in the flashes of the lightning. But it was probably the best thing that happened the entire night. And as we were wrapping up the end of the night, the wife of the man came over and dragged him over and said to her husband, tell him, go on, tell him. Apparently, to cut the long story short, he was standing at the front of the group, and he said to me, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I saw that figure. Insert expletive, saw that figure. It was there. That scared the bejesus out of me." And it was like, I still don't want to, and he said, and this was the classic, but I still don't want to believe, but I know what I saw. It was interesting. It was challenging his whole belief system, which he found uncomfortable. I mean, I've seen things over the years. I've been doing this for 20, 30 years. I'm not exaggerating. And I would list probably no more than a dozen occasions when I've definitely genuinely seen something paranormal. So I'm not one of the ones who jumps on every little experience I ever had to say that's genuine. It's really got to tick lots of boxes for me. And I saw that figure that night, and there was no doubt about it. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but it was an adult-sized form that was standing at the end of the corridor, and everybody who was in the group was with us. There was no way it was any one of us, because I was quite close to the front as well. The guy was probably standing quite close to me, the guy who spoke to me afterwards. But yeah, that was one of those examples. You get those where people have these experiences, and yet, because it doesn't really want to fit with their belief system, they will dismiss it. Now, I'm not saying you're doing that at all, Charles, obviously, but sometimes the desire to see something impressive means you might miss little things, and often it's the little things that throw people. They're like little stones that seem to get thrown across a room, and think, "Well, it's just a stone, but hang on, there's no one over there to have thrown that stone." Oh yeah, I suppose. It's that kind of thing. And very rarely you get those real full manifestations. I mean, probably no more than 2 or 3 times, and that is hundreds, and I mean hundreds of investigations I've ever seen anything like that. So you never know, Charles. It's never too late.
Yeah, well, I say I'm a believer. In the sense, I'm a believer. I don't want of those who say, "Oh, nothing like that stuff and nonsense doesn't happen, doesn't go on." It's just that I've never seen anything that makes me say, "Yeah, that was a ghost." But I have had, spooky sensations and uneasy feelings and things of that nature. But there again, you don't know whether it's your imagination or whether there's something there behind it.
Yes, no, I agree entirely. I mean, that plays the part. I mean, there have been certain occasions where I've been, again, with groups of people who've had a strange experience of seeing something, but then when you ask them what they've seen, you get quite different stories. The unifying factor is they agree they've seen something, but they don't necessarily see the same thing. Again, I think that could come down to belief systems. I mean, I've worked a little bit on this theory that these things, entities, energies, whatever you want to call them, are completely amorphous. They have no identity of their own other than that which we give them, that we put upon them, which is why we were saying before about these things can appear to be different to different people. And even the idea of the modern images of things like the black-eyed kids. I always want to say black-eyed peas. We have to stop saying that. And so
I got a feeling.
And then things like the Slender Man, it's almost like we're projecting onto them the image we want to see.
Yes, that's definitely it. And when you go back again, to talking to people about ghosts, if you're talking to, would have been my grandmother's generation, whenever there were ghost stories mentioned, they were always people in Edwardian Victorian fashions, because of course that was what they would have seen. That's what people wore. It'd be interesting to know whether if there was a manifestation, whether by modern eyes it was wearing something entirely different to a modern spectator.
I think that's one of the most common phenomena now, even though you tend to get people in Victorian stroke Edwardian clothing or what is seen. Let's say the tall figure in the rear corridor of Woodchester was described as being exactly that, Edwardian or Victorian. And I do think there's got to be a tie with the fact that that is the period when ghost hunting and ghost mysteries and supernatural stories and things like the Theosophical Society and spiritualism, they all began in that period. So it seems because they were seen at that time and would appear that way, that it's colouring our view. Because it's often said, well, if you go to very old locations, why don't you see much older ghosts? And the only example I can give is an investigation place called Dundon Hill, which is a few miles out of Glastonbury. Dundon Hill is an Iron Age fort. Now, there was a group of us there, again, didn't see anything as such, but all had the distinct impression of a figure that was walking around the ridges of the Iron Age fort. Again, you would be guessing to say any kind of description of that person, but that was clearly very old. There was no two ways about that. But predominantly, people will always talk about the Victorian lady, Victorian gentleman in those clothes.
Yes.
Even the building they're in is much older than that. It's funny that there's got to be a time with that time frame of where it first started to really emerge, and then what people describe.
Yes, well, I mean, we were talking about the internet earlier, but the Victorian era was the era when literature and cheap paperbacks and magazines started to become easily accessible, and people could afford them, and there was a rise in literacy. So that was an era, that's what they were reading about. They were reading about the ghosts of women in a bustle or men in top hats, whereas now we're reading on social media about black-eyed children. It must be that element there.
Absolutely,
which comes back to where we began, where you scratch what seems to be an odd story, but there's an explanation behind it, even if it's a different explanation to what you first thought it would be.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. The transmogrification, the transformation of these stories as you go along, often trying to get back to the real source material. And sometimes you find there is something, and sometimes you find it's just all been made up. Certainly.
Yes, yeah. Which is another area that fascinates me, the ones that have been made up. And again, how urban myths develop. We featured one in the show last week.
Yeah.
It was a guy in the 1930s who wrote a series of ripping yarns for people taking boating holidays about ghosts. And then when it was reprinted 40 years later, the new publisher neglected to mention it was fiction. And it was taken as a ghost hunter's Bible. And there was a local group in East Anglia who sort of spent several years standing out in the dark in graveyards in the rain, waiting for ghosts. And then they learned, no, he'd made them all up.
Oh dear, that's such a shame. That is a shame. Well, I'm just wondering if the stories that I tell about this house one day will change as it's being spoken by various other people, and they will become legends.
Indeed. Maybe we are the ghosts of the future. We'll become legendary.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we could be the ghosts of the future.
Well,
that would be funny, wouldn't
I
it?
wanted to briefly go back a bit, because we started talking about subjects like Slender Man, how they've suddenly become a made-up story is people are actually seeing this now, or at least they're claiming they're seeing this. And from an investigator's standpoint, it seems to me that we have an ability in our cultures, in our societies, that we could take stories and something in that within our collective consciousness, these paranormal things that we witness seem to take on the visage of what it is that we're expecting to see. How often do people in Celtic folklore talk about fairies and gnomes and things like that? Pixies. Sorry, Irene, almost forgot the Cornish pixies.
Goblins.
And goblins. But we need the Cornish
pixies. We are
pixies.
officially goblin free.
Yes. We're goblin free, yes. That's never going to get old. Anyway, but, it seems that in many cases, whatever some of these things that we're dealing with, whether it's ghosts or maybe something else, maybe some kind of elemental types of entity or beings that are able to present themselves in forms that we would understand. You know, how many people see the Virgin Mary, okay, and not being Catholic, since I don't believe the Virgin Mary in that story, but what if, you know, these types of higher beings or whatever, or even lower beings, can shapeshift and make themselves look like things that they know would scare somebody or be meaningful to somebody. So Slender Man, people hear about Slender Man, maybe not fully understanding that it was totally made up. They love the story. Next thing you know, they're seeing Slender Man in the woods.
Absolutely. As I say, that is very much seems to be what's happened with Woodchester Mansion. The term has been applied to a kind of vaguer presence that was seen in there. I mean, I think you and Mark have talked about this before, that whole Ray Bradbury thing, the Martian Chronicles, when one of the Martians walks into the church on Mars and the vicar turns around and sees Jesus standing there because he's implanted onto the Martian person the image that he expects to see, and the guy's literally, the Martian is literally saying, no, you're seeing what you basically want to see. You're making me appear this way, and actually it's hurting me. Please stop it, effectively. So it's almost as if it's involuntary that we're putting onto these, I use the term amorphous creatures, this information, this belief system, this imagery that's coming from us, and it appears to be as that. And I find that the Bradbury thing, I think, is a very good summation of that, and basically is what you're saying there, definitely.
Well, in the same vein, there's also, let me say this real quick, Irene. In the same context, there are people who have near-death experiences. How many people have a near-death experience? They see either Jesus or St. Francis or St. Michael or any of these archangel or saints that are very popular, and specifically from those people's backgrounds. You talk to a Catholic person, they're going to see St. Francis, St. Michael, or Jesus. You know, one of those three. You talk to somebody from another culture, they're going to see somebody else that's based in their culture. Are these things changing their appearance to show themselves in a certain way so that they could be more understood?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There's no particular form or shape of their own. They're taking on what is either they take on because it fits our psychic model, if you like, or we project onto them. You know, it's a very different way of thinking about it, actually, one way or the other. One's much more that they're in control, i.e. they manifest the way they want for us to fit with us, or we are putting onto them our thinking processes, so we're controlling them. At an unconscious level, of course, not like you're deliberately saying, right, I want you to appear as Mary Queen of Scots or something. You know, it's more compliant with our belief system. So yeah, I find that the whole idea fascinating.
I'm sorry, Irene.
Okay, right. Can I get one in now?
Guys, should we? Should we let her in?
Your show.
Okay, you go ahead.
Yeah.
Getting back to your show, Charles. It's divided into several sections, which every section is interesting, and you put that little bit of comedy factor into it as well, which I love. But which part do you really enjoy doing?
Well, that's a bit hard to say because I've only done two. so
make your mind up now.
and there's been an element of struggling with technology and struggling with things and learning the ropes which have been going on. So it's a bit hard to say. The object has always been to combine information with an element of entertainment, so that
which
it's
you do, which you really do,
which is what I want to do, and I enjoy all the bits of it. But I think it really needs a little bit longer, and to get a feel for it, which I think will appear as to which bits really sing and which bits don't quite, and which bits are great fun and which bits are, I wonder why we thought of this was a good idea. But I at the moment, I enjoy all of them.
Yeah, well, it's a very, very entertaining show, I must admit. It really is. And I learn. Okay, you've only done a couple of shows and one's been out, but I've learned. So is it one out or two out, Mark?
Two out.
Yeah, we've had two shows so far.
Yeah, I've been off of the circuit for a little while. So, but I know that the first show, I definitely loved the first show. I was laughing. I was learning. it just had everything, Charles. It had everything that I was interested in. And so if I loved it, other people have got to love it. It's a great show. It really is a great show. Okay,
thank
boys.
you very much.
Well, you can carry on now. I have to step back now. I've said my bit.
Right.
What other types of subjects really fascinate you, Charles?
In what sort of context?
Is there anything that you haven't been talking about in terms of legends or whatnot that do intrigue you that you would like to be talking about at some point?
Well, I think I'm covering most of the things that have got, if you like, a paranormal angle to them. One of the areas I'm always fascinated in is medieval history, particularly pre-Norman conquest, and basically generations of kings being beastly to each other and killing each other in increasingly vile ways. It's the whole Game of Thrones, but this is the original version of it. This is for real, and some of those will be coming into the series later on when we start looking at more ghosts and more spectres and more manifestations. I'm also intrigued, and we touch on it slightly in the next show, on this concept of folk horror, the sort of, well, we touched on it in the latest show on M.R. James, the element of the sort of inherent spookiness of the countryside that we live in. That there's something about England, particularly where I am in the Eastern Counties, that's timeless, if you like, and mysterious and intriguing. But they don't always lend themselves to being wrapped up into a sort of a 5-minute snippet. But that whole atmosphere element of folklore and legends.
I must say I'm quite a fan of M.R. James myself. I recently got back into his writings. Come quite friendly with a chap called Eddie Brazil, who's been involved in ghost investigations for many years, and he's also a big fan as well. And he actually gave me one of M.R. James's books, the Suffolk and Norfolk book, which is a tour of the 2 counties by M.R. James, and it captures that. It's almost, you can't quite put your finger on it, the atmosphere, the feeling of that part of the world, especially. I mean, I'm down here in Essex, not too far away from it. I mean, I've always been fascinated by a place like Dunwich, the town experience. It's a place I've been to on a number of occasions, and it's just got an atmosphere to it. Not least the fact you've got open graveyards with bones sticking out of it, which of course helps. But
yes,
the town itself has got this amazing atmosphere to it. And in fact, they've done a bit of work to preserve what they believe is the very last remaining gravestone, which was literally on the edge of the cliff and about to fall in, and they've built around it and reinforced it. So the last grave of the last graveyard to go into the sea has finally been preserved, which is quite something, actually. And it's a recognition of the place.
Yes, and I mean, that's all of those disappearing towns of the East Coast. I mean, Dunwich was, there's a bit of academic argument over it, but is generally reckoned to have been the site of one of the earliest Christian bishoprics in when started to bring back Christianity after the Saxons had invaded. And it was a major city with, a dozen churches and abbeys and priories, and there's just nothing now. Except a very good fish and chip shop. I'm sure you've seen that one on the...
That is quite true. I mean, I was there very recently, and walking past what remains of the abbey there, and I had a friend of mine who's quite the psychic. She's quite a mediumistic, and didn't know an awful lot about the area, and was picking up all sorts of strange activity that may have occurred. And I know, of course, it's made quite famous also by another writer, horror writer, H.P. Lovecraft, of course, based one of his stories there. And, of course, the legend that John Dee was fascinated by the place too. So it's definitely a place of myth and legend, and somewhere I like to visit as often as I can.
No, it is. It's a place that you think this can't be real. It's a set, it's a set from a horror movie or something. Any moment, we're going to have the Witchfinder General ride past.
Yes, absolutely. Or you're going to have some strange, nameless abomination start to crawl out of the sea. Very much in the theme of H.P. Lovecraft. You can almost see it.
Yes.
But yeah, it is one of those places that you can understand. I don't think for a moment Lovecraft ever visited the town. If he's ever visited the UK, but certainly he'd read about it. Because I think they've said it would have been probably the similar kind of size to Canterbury had it survived, had not fallen into the sea. It was a very much a major seaport at the time, wasn't it?
It was indeed, yes. And I say it was a major ecclesiastical centre. So if not on a line with Canterbury, certainly York. It was a major centre.
Sorry. Did pilgrims go there then? Like Canterbury?
No, they didn't.
Oh,
they didn't. It was too decayed. It started to fall into the sea quite early on, and it never quite had that. It was Saint Felix who was there, who wasn't really wasn't really a crowd puller in terms of that.
Oh, I see. I understand. Only I've been to Canterbury so many times, so I know Canterbury well. But
Yeah.
So this place has this place disappeared now?
I was going to say that it has pretty much. There are just a few ruins.
It's a village, isn't it? There? Quite a few people living there, but it is pretty much a village. That's just on the extreme edge of what remains of it. Again, there's a very nice pub as well. Actually, a very large pub there. There's a little museum too. So if you do get a chance to head that way up, it's well worth visiting, definitely.
But the pub is more important. Yeah, the pub is more important.
No shops. No
I
shops.
would say the pub itself is actually quite expensive as well to buy to eat in. So better off with the fish and chip shop rather than the pub for your dinner.
Yeah. No, the fish and chip shop is legendary.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see. Okay then. Right, so I remember if I ever go there, don't head for the pub, head for the fish and chip shop.
Yes, certainly.
Okay. Yeah, lovely. Right, so do you want to speak a bit more about the show?
Well, I was going to ask Charles about his lovely wife who participated with him in the first show. She does such a great job herself, too. Is she going to be a regular feature with you on your shows? Or?
Oh, yeah. No, she's in the second show, and she will be, and we're going to, if you like, build up her part and try and get more double act repartee going on with that as we progress the program, as we progress it. So she's definitely a part.
Oh, that's good.
Thoroughly enjoying it, and is I think doing a bit of reading up for some ideas for the next show already.
Yeah.
How does
she's got enthusiasm then, unlike me.
Oh no, don't say that.
Well, let me ask you, with everything that you're interested in, is she interested in the same thing, or do you find yourself at odds sometimes towards certain subjects?
She's possibly more skeptical than me, but again has the interest in the fact that all this stuff must have come from somewhere, and what's the origins of it, and that's the interesting part of it, and it's just the fascination, and it's an insight into the human mind that people believe that if you do this, then this will happen, and it helps throw an insight onto human motivations.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Irene, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. In the intro to the show, Charles, you mentioned the werewolf is mentioned. Now, what is your take on the werewolf?
Well, the werewolf, my take on the werewolf was I wrote a book about the folklore of the East Riding, And in historical terms, England is remarkably thin on the ground for werewolves. It's not one of our paranormal supernatural bogies.
Yeah.
We have lots of other things, but we don't have werewolves. We don't have a werewolf culture. And the only one that's ever popped up is this one in area of Yorkshire, and it was called Old Stinker because of its foul breath, and it was reputed to haunt the area during the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. And I got involved when there were reports in Hull a couple of years ago that a werewolf had been sighted, and that's where we went up to Hull to have a look at it. To go on a werewolf hunt, courtesy of a Sunday newspaper who sent us up there on a full moon and said, "Bring us some pictures back of a werewolf."
Oh, sorry. Go on, carry on.
So we were rather hoping we didn't encounter one, because if it was a real one, we wouldn't be here anyway.
No, I doubt it.
But I was just intrigued, and I say this is again another of these stories where you can see where the stories came from, because this area historically was plagued by wolves.
Yeah.
And there was an actual hostel there because people would be eaten by them. And then you had all the Vikings who invaded through that area on a couple of occasions. You had the berserkers who were the bearskins, and you have another one whose name I can't pronounce at this time of night, the Wolfwear, who wore wolfskins. And so if you were some poor little Saxon hiding in your burnt out hut, and you saw this Viking army going past with these half-naked, blood-splattered Viking warriors wearing wolf skins, you'd say, those aren't men, those are wolves. Yeah. And the term werewolf comes from wolfman, or a man-wolf.
Yeah.
And these were men-wolves.
You don't think that a lot of the legends crossed over with the Shuck lizards, the legends of the Shuck, do you? The dogs, phantom dogs.
Phantom dogs. I mean, this is where we are. We're
Black Shuck
country down here. That is an overlap. But again, there are so many phantom dogs, demon dog, black dog legends all around the country.
They all go under different names as well, don't they?
They go under different names. There is a website, and it's got little arrows for each sighting. The whole East Coast is just thick in them. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of them. So there's clearly something there. I don't think it's the werewolf. I think it's something more. Black Shuck is meant to be not so much a big dog as an actual demon or a manifestation of the devil, but in other ones it's a big fierce dog, and they have different roles. Sometimes the dog is there to foretell you're like a death. Sometimes they're there for protection, sometimes not quite sure why they're there.
They're guarding from something. Guardian.
So
you don't think sorry, I'm talking over you. I don't know why this is happening tonight. But you don't think also...
Four of us online.
Yeah. You don't think also that this overlaps with the legend in America, mainly in America, of Dogman as well?
I think the English black dog, black shuck thing has been going on longer than people have been aware of Dogman.
Yeah. Dogman's I can't say the word, fairly new as well, isn't it, when you think about it in years?
That's 10 or 20 years, I think.
Yeah, 10 or 20 years, something like that.
It's the shuck and black dogs, I think possibly have more to do with Norse mythology, with they're very keen on big dogs and big wolves, and the gods have them and follow them, and what is it? Odin had Huggin and Muggin, was it, or something like that?
Yeah.
His 2 large dogs, and Fenrir, the big wolf, that turns up at Ragnarok and eats everybody.
They were ravens,
those...
but yeah, the wolf one.
Oh, they were ravens.
Yeah, no, the wolf
Yes.
mates. So my other book's on runes, so it's not something I know very well. But no, you absolutely. The Ragnarok, I think with the Fenris wolf, that is a big part. Of course, bites off Tyr's hand, so it plays a huge part in the mythology.
Well, guys, unfortunately,
Yes.
we've run out of time. We've actually gone quite over here. So we're going to need to wrap this up. But Charles, thank you for coming on the show. And again, we'll remind everybody that Urban Fantasist is on the 1st and 3rd Sundays every month on the Paranormal UK Radio Network at 11 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time and Eastern Standard Time. But thank you again for coming on. It's great talking with you.
Thanks very much indeed. Great talking to you all 3.
Absolutely.
And Irene and Andy, have a great evening.
Yeah,
You too.
no, not at all.